Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I am the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. I want to welcome you to the presentation of this volume, of which I am a co-author along with Dr. Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera of George Mason University in Northern Virginia. It is truly a pleasure for me to present this research, which took about 4 years to complete. It is the product of a series of interviews that have to do with security. Security evidently has become quite the challenge in the 21st century for Mexico. It is perhaps the greatest challenge in terms of public policy in Mexico, and many other areas of the country depend on the issue of security. The book obviously focuses on the Calderón administration, 2006 to 2012. So I want to welcome you to this discussion, and I want to introduce to you, to begin the discussion, Dr. Sergio Aguayo, who's currently at Harvard University as a visiting scholar, but who is affiliated as a professor at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. Sergio will provide some remarks, and then after that, he will hand the microphone over to our guest, commentator, and moderator, David Luno of the Wall Street Journal. Sergio, please, you're next.
Thanks, Tony, for the invitation. Thanks, Guadalupe. And it's a pleasure to be in this table with David. I have 3 ideas, 2 about the book and 1 that is a consequence of the book, a logical consequence of the book. In my opinion, the book makes very strongly 2 interconnected points. The first one is the best explanation that I have seen about the reasons, the rationale, the evolution of the thinking of the Calderón administration. Why Calderón all of a sudden in December 2006 decided to launch an all-out war against the cartels? There are many explanations. He has justified himself in many ways, but there has not been an attempt, and you, Tony and Guadalupe, were very successful in doing that, to go to the root causes and to be able to interview the people that were making the decisions or that were observing at a very close range what was going on. So it is a very good explanation of the origins of a war that is already, it's in its 15th anniversary. The second, it is the decision to emphasize the importance that the US has played in the war in Mexico, or the insecurity in Mexico, because this is the poisoned apple of the academic and political discussion, because who is responsible for the war? And those who buy the drugs in the US or those who provide the drugs? Who is responsible? The merchants that sell the weapons to the cartels, or those who buy the weapons? And I think that the 2 governments are very careful not to blame each other excessively, because they know that they are in a slippery ground. Because if one wants to understand better the insecurity in Mexico, one has to take a binational perspective. More than that, I argue that one has to take a regional perspective, because we are in a phenomenon of violence that encompass the 27 countries that are part of the Caribbean basin. But Mexico and the US are, no doubt about it, the 2 most important actors. So we cannot understand violence, criminal violence in the region without taking this approach. And that brings me to my third point, which is, and what is going to be done with this knowledge? Not only the book of Payan and Guadalupe, because there is an impressive amount of analysis produced by journalists, scholars, NGOs, think tanks, governments, intelligence agencies. And my question is, what are we going to do with all this knowledge? And that brings me to what I think is the only solution, real solution for the criminal violence is to take a binational and an integral approach to the issue of violence. Until the US and Mexico, the point I want to make, or I make, is that in order to tackle with criminal violence, the US and Mexico and the US have come to terms with that fact, that it is a joint problem. I know that shared responsibility is a concept that comes back and forth every now and then, but to tell you the truth, and that is present in the book, it is a concept, it is an empty concept, because nor the US nor Mexico are willing to go really to discuss the responsibilities of the two countries in order to find a solution. Now, I think we are reaching a point of crisis due to the increase of insecurity in Mexico and the number of people assassinated and the number of people in the US that die consuming fentanyl, which is provided mostly by the Mexicans. So eventually in the near future, we will have to take this joint perspective, this shared approach. And I think that I don't see the conditions in Mexico now for a review of the policies. I think that the government of López Obrador has exhausted itself. It doesn't have solutions. It doesn't have the will. It doesn't have the interest in security. They are muddling through with the idea that if they are nice with the cartels, perhaps the cartels will be nice with the government, not with the people. The people is expendable from that perspective. I think that the best moment and I think that we scholars and journalists have a responsibility to push this kind of the elections. The two elections, presidential elections in 24, are the ideal moment to push for a new paradigm, of a joint security approach to the question of criminal violence that was born in the US in the 1920s, but that now has become a Frankenstein in the Mexico of the 20s. That's it.
Let me follow the words of Sergio Aguayo, who, by the way, was instrumental in publishing this book, read the manuscript, gave us plenty of feedback on it, and of course, shepherded the publication of the book. So thank you, Sergio, for that. So let me now introduce the centerpiece of this conversation, David Luno, the Latin American editor for the Wall Street Journal, based in Mexico City, who will offer his own commentary on the book and then engage Dr. Correa-Cabrera and me in a conversation before we open it to the Q&A. It is really a pleasure for me to have David Luno in this conversation. His coverage of Latin America and especially Mexico is stellar for the Wall Street Journal, and of course a reference among journalists in terms of what we need to know in the United States about what's going on in Mexico. David, the floor and the microphone are yours. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be here with you guys and with Sergio, whose work I've admired for many years. I have a confession to make. When you first invited me and I first saw the book on Calderón, I thought, geez, why reach back so far and pick on Calderón? He at least tried to fix some of this. Peña and AMLO have really dropped the ball since then. But in reading the book, I think it was a very good decision. And I think you guys do a great job of laying out why we need to look at the Calderón sexenio and understand the correct lessons from that in order to make better decisions going forward. I want to start on January 3rd, 2007, when Calderón, who had just started his presidency a month before, turned up at the Joint Operating Command Center in Apatzingán, Michoacán, to meet with the heads of the Army, the Navy, and the Federal Police, who were there to oversee an operation to take back territory in Michoacán that had been taken over by drug gangs. In a visit that would mark the rest of his presidency, he wore military fatigues. That day, Calderón warned of a long battle ahead against organized crime, saying it wouldn't be easy and would take the rest of his administration. And he was right. A few days later, he would refer to this battle as a war. He had become a wartime president. The decision to declare war against the cartels would mark his presidency in Mexico's history ever since. For Calderón, he had just come off a very narrow election victory, one in which the losing side refused to concede and had called for mass protests. And he perhaps wanted to show that he was the actual commander-in-chief and not the other guy wearing a fake presidential sash. And maybe, given his short stature, he has a bit of a Napoleonic complex. But that doesn't mean he did this for purely political reasons. He seems convinced that this was the right thing to do, and many agree with him. Cartels were growing so strong, they were openly defying security forces, driving around in large armed convoys on Mexican highways and in towns, taking over territory, bribing and controlling local politicians, and starting to extort businesses. Michoacán's state governor had called for help, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears in the administration of President Vicente Fox. Calderón is from Michoacán, as you guys rightly point out in the book, and he cared deeply about what was happening in his native state. And hey, maybe he could benefit politically from being the guy who took on the cartels and won, both for himself in history books and his party at the polls. So he calls out the army to deal with the problem. And what happens next is laid out very well in the book. I'll try to summarize it quickly. Mexico wasn't close to being ready to take on the cartels. It didn't have the right institutions, from cops that could arrest a bad guy to prosecutors who could charge him, to a prison system that could hold them. And its military would turn out to not be up to the job. After all, soldiers are trained not to arrest people, they are trained to kill people. So Calderón implements a strategy on the fly, one that sucks him and the nation into, at best, a stalemate against the cartels. By some measures, he's successful. His strategy, aided by the US, breaks up the big cartels and arrests several key kingpins. But the consequences are horrific, particularly for Mexico: soaring violence and a diversification of smaller drug gangs into areas like extortion. Ultimately, in taking on the cartels and being seen to fail, it affects the political landscape and governments that succeed Calderón, because while he may have had very good reasons for challenging the cartels and eventually hit upon a somewhat successful formula for doing so, his plan was seen as a failure and in part set the stage for his successors to fail to draw the right lessons in how to create security in Mexico. Mexico is now caught in a chicken or egg situation. It can't stop relying on the army to pursue organized crime because it doesn't have the police. And it can't stop relying on the army because it isn't building the police forces to take its place. Calderón started this important work, made some mistakes, but largely ran out of time because building these kinds of institutions takes a generation, not a sexenio. As they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. His successors gave it up, and it's an open question when Mexico may finally learn the right lessons from the Calderón presidency. I liked the cover of the book because it shows the fog of war. We couldn't really see what was happening at the time. And I think this book is a very welcome attempt to use the distance of a few years to understand more clearly what happened and what to learn from it, to cut through the fog, as it were. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what I had seen in my time covering this area and areas that I think the book does a good job of. I think to understand what's happening now, it's really important to understand the run-up to Calderón's presidency and what the situation was that he faced. We all know Mexico had one of the longest running single-party states in the world. From 1929 to 2000, it was run by the PRI. And for much of that time, especially in the 60s and 70s, Mexico had a pax mafiosa. I think the basic thinking behind it was this: if the gringos wanted to smoke pot and sniff white powder up their nose, and we can make some money selling them this stuff, who were we to say no? So everybody was happy. The drug gangs were basically allowed to operate. Politicians got a cut of the money, and things were relatively stable because the government laid down some rules that the bad guys had to follow. No kidnapping, no selling drugs here, and if you have to kill someone, do it discreetly. And the government had the power to enforce those rules. There's a good quote of former Attorney General Medina Mora in the book talking about how the PRI kept the underworld in check. The president had 4 security institutions that reported directly to him: the Army, the Navy, the Presidential Guard, and Mexico City cops. This is crucial to understand. Any authoritarian country can control the bad guys because they don't have to mind things like rule of law or habeas corpus. They just kill them or lock them up arbitrarily if they get out of line. We decided to do a series on violence in Latin America a few years ago. And I remember looking at murder rates across the world. And what really struck me is how much higher murder rates were in places like Mexico, for instance, compared to the Middle East, places like Egypt, where murders were 1 per 100,000 compared to 10, 15, 20, 25 per 100,000 in Mexico. And I think a big reason for that is these countries still have authoritarian governments. They can kill the bad guys without giving them due process. Of course, that was an unsustainable model in Mexico and created long-term problems in several ways. It allowed organized crime to grow. It encouraged corruption and the penetration of the state by drug gangs, and it neglected law enforcement institutions, or worse, turned them into tools of an alliance between politicians and crime lords. But it did keep a lid on violence. And it's that has been sort of the shiny object that the 2 administrations after Calderón keep returning to. It's not surprising that the PRI did it because it was their model. And it's perhaps not surprising that the current president, as a former Priista, is also doing it. But of course, that model was never very sustainable. With democracy, different parties start winning power in different states. And so these types of arrangements with organized crime start to break down. And it creates new space for competition and rivalry among drug gangs. This state of affairs completely broke down under Fox when the federal government changed, and Fox weakened the intelligence services, having mistrusted them as tools of the PRI. So the government no longer had the power to enforce the punishments that would keep cartels in line. I think there are other factors that came into play here. I just want to mention because they were outside the scope of this book, but we all remember the show Miami Vice in the 1980s about how the Colombian cocaine would go up through the Caribbean to Miami. Well, the Americans eventually decided to shut down that route, and in doing so had very large unintended consequences for Mexico. A lot of that volume of cocaine simply got shifted in the balloon effect to Mexico, giving Mexican cartels suddenly much higher volumes of drugs than they had handled previously. At the same time, Colombia started cracking down on its big cartels, and it pulverized the number of suppliers. So Mexican drug gangs, we at the Journal like to follow the finances of this stuff. Mexican drug gangs went from being called what you would say price takers. They negotiated with 1 or 2 big Colombian cartels in the past, and they had to take the price the Colombian cartels would give them, to being price setters. They could negotiate with any number of smaller Colombian suppliers and play them off one another. So you suddenly had much higher volumes of drugs and a much higher profit margin coming through Mexico at the same time that these political arrangements were breaking up. Also at the same time were generational changes in the Mexican cartels. Luis Astorga writes very well about how many of these cartels were sort of family businesses when they started up in Sinaloa and Jalisco. But like a family company, by the time you get to the second or third generation, you have shareholder disputes. And in an illegal market like the drugs industry, these aren't resolved in courtrooms, they're resolved on the streets. Then in 2004, the US lifted the assault weapons ban. So you have all of these policies coming together and all of these things coming together at the same time. When Calderón takes over, then the question is, what does one do about these groups? And I think the book does a very good job of presenting the different views. Some people argue that he unnecessarily kicked a hornet's nest and caused the violence. Others argue that without having taken on the narcos, the alternative reality may have been worse. You might have ended up with a state being utterly captured by growing drug cartels. I also think you guys do a very good job of laying out the mistakes. Calderón has an improvised strategy, clearly. He doesn't consult a wide range of actors. He doesn't get buy-in from other political forces. And he says not, but what he really wanted, and I think I sensed this at the time, is a quick win. And he got one first in Michoacán. You send out the military, the bad guys run and hide, and as they say in Spanish, te cuelgas la medalla. You think you've won that first battle. The problem was, and I always thought this at the time, what the army was doing in a lot of these places is basically just patrolling for show. You get them out in the towns, you put them on the highways, and yeah, the bad guys kind of hide for a while, but when the military eventually goes, the bad guys just come right back out. So the strategy, after its first initial success, showed that it really didn't have a lot more to it. The reliance on the military, as we've said, soldiers aren't cops. Look at the US experience in Afghanistan. The military does one thing very well. It fights battles, but it struggles to do other things well, like build institutions. I was told by a US Army trainer that they tried 3 times to build a national Afghan police force, and 3 times they failed. They had to start from scratch because it had gotten completely corrupted. So Mexico, the army in Mexico, is also going to struggle to build a National Guard that is capable of solving organized crime. There's a moral hazard problem. By sending in the federal government and the police, it allowed state governments and municipalities to wash their hands of the matter and broke any healthy feedback loop between local authorities combating crime and voters that might reward or punish them. A good chapter on the Americans. There's a reliance on the Americans and the kingpin strategy that comes from the DEA. If you follow this from the American point of view, it makes a lot of sense. Gee, let's get Mexico to stop the flow of drugs that are coming on our streets, and let's have them kill or capture the cartel leaders. But for Mexico, this isn't such a great strategy because, as we all know by now, the capturing of cartel leaders just fragmented the cartels, led to much more violent fights between them and raised violence levels. I would say I interviewed Calderón 3 times during his term. I think the first time was in the first 2 years, the second time in the middle 2, and the last time in the last 2. And I would say he did learn on the job. I think he came to the belated realization that the army wasn't going to solve the problem and that Mexico needed a real law enforcement system and set about building the federal police. They also overhauled the judicial system, but how serious was that of a commitment? We have a saying in journalism, follow the money. And as the book points out, his budget didn't dramatically boost money to the judicial system, which is where you see the priorities. He wanted force to solve these problems, cops and soldiers. But where were the detectives and prosecutors? The Michoacanazo showed clearly that attempts by the Mexican judicial system to arrest politicians in the pay of cartel members failed disastrously because they didn't have the capacity to enforce such law enforcement cases. In the end, I think you guys do a great job of pointing out the lessons learned and where Mexico needs to go from here. More than ever, the military is in charge of the drug war. And I think my favorite line in the book is the line that reads, Mexico and its leaders don't seem to have the patience required to build institutions. One of my favorite books is Why Nations Fail by the MIT economist Daron Acemoglu and the University of Chicago economist James Robinson, because I think they do a very good job of describing why countries that fail because they've built institutions that are extractive, that basically extract money and power from those on the bottom, rather than inclusive institutions like democracies, open political parties, rule of law, things like that, that help include people at the bottom and create better institutions. And, this idea of institutions, to anybody who knows Mexico, is really the crux of what goes wrong in Mexico and why the country's been incapable of really becoming a modern country. And Mexico has shown it can build decent institutions. In the 1980s, the country kept sliding into so many financial crises that by the 1980s, I think the political class realized that they weren't going to let the politicians run the economy anymore. So they basically created an independent central bank, a very professional finance ministry that became the envy of other Latin American countries. I once had an Argentine guy telling me, boy, can you imagine if Argentina had Mexican-style macroeconomic management? Estaríamos en la gloria. Well, Mexico did create these good institutions, including an electoral agency and other kinds of regulatory bodies that work. But they've never done this with security and the judicial system. And it's always driven me a little bit crazy, to be honest. At first, I thought they just didn't get it. Don't you guys understand how important these institutions are? And then I read a book by Rachel Kleinman that talked about basically the sad truth is they don't want to get it. Politicians are unwilling to give up that part of their power because they want to have a judicial system they can use against their enemies. And they want to have a police force they can manipulate to not arrest their friends and corrupt cronies. Peru's president, Oscar Benavides, put it well way back when he said, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." Now, Garcia Luna was building up a federal police force, but the Peña administration ignored it and AMLO killed it. Obviously, now there are problems with the person that was chosen to build up this institution. State level efforts have led to mixed success. In Nuevo León, they did the Fuerza Civil, which was built up well, but the next governor came in and let it all go to waste. And the same with building a judicial system. The army can fight a battle. It can take over physical space and arrest a drug lord. It can seize drugs, but it can't launch a sophisticated operation to take apart a cartel or create justice. In my travels, I've gotten to know quite well the head of the national police, the different national police chiefs in Colombia. And it's really interesting to see how well Colombia has built up some of their law enforcement institutions, including the judiciary and the national police. And, he mentioned one thing that he thought that Mexico had sort of failed to do in the kingpin strategy, which was that in Mexico, thanks to the DEA, they would basically just arrest the top of the cartel and walk away and sort of colgarse la medalla and say, we're done, we dismantled this cartel. Well, in Colombia, they didn't act against cartel leaders until they had the top 15 or 20 people identified and could go arrest them all at the same time. They then did follow-up operations 2 or 3 months later to arrest the new generation that was starting to come up and replace those old leaders. And in that way, I think they've been much more successful in pulverizing the cartels than Mexico has. Anyway, I'll wrap things up. I think you guys do a very good job of showing the trade-offs involved, how it's very easy to criticize Calderón for this, but I think you guys do a good job of speaking to people who admire what he tried to do, yet recognize the shortcomings, and people who think he really made terrible mistakes for political reasons. I think the role of the US is also very interesting. So with that, I'd love to kick off some questions for you guys, if you agree. First question is why did you decide to write this book, and why did you guys decide to do it together? Tony, you want to start and then have Guadalupe answer?
Sure. Yes. Well, obviously, myself and Dr. Correa, Lupita, have always been interested in the issue of security in Mexico. I think it's part of our line of research from very early on. When I finished my PhD at Georgetown in 2000, even before I was already paying attention to what was going on in Mexico. And so there was already kind of a vocation. And eventually we met and we coincided in this line of research, exchanged quite a few views on it. And there was to me, there was a clear model, which is a very journalistic model, if you will. I have always admired the books of great journalists like Bob Woodward, for example, who actually go into the entrails of the bureaucracy and the politicians and patiently conduct this series of interviews and explore different aspects of decision making and personalities and infighting and bureaucracies and so on. My own dissertation was a lot about these bureaucracies and things like that. And so I thought, well, this is kind of a book that should reflect that. It should reflect my interest in the issue of security, my passion for Mexico, this more journalistic style, which has kind of a certain academic rigor, and then a certain degree of historical consequence and public policy relevance. And then, of course, I think Lupita has a similar approach. The one interesting thing about this book is that Lupita and I could not possibly disagree more. In fact, one of the most interesting experiences is that over the months, as we moved to Mexico City, back and forth to interview different people, we often went to a coffee shop afterwards after an interview, and I was always amazed at how we interviewed the same person but appeared to have heard completely different stories. And so it was very, very difficult, because afterwards, when we had the material, when we had the recordings and the transcripts, almost every line had to be negotiated, painstakingly negotiated and worked on and agreed on. And finally, what we decided to do is to give different versions of the same thing. And we realized that it was a valuable thing to do, because you realize that somebody who was inside had one perspective, one view, one set of information, and somebody who was outside, a critic perhaps, had a different perception, a different understanding, and we just contrasted the two views. And so the book is it kind of weaves all these different perspectives, sometimes on a single point, and then we let them kind of dialogue among themselves. We construct the dialogue in that way. But it was very difficult, because I think I, like you, for example, think that Calderón at least tried, perhaps mistakenly, perhaps that wasn't ready. He didn't build a political consensus that was required. The governors were not with him. The transition to democracy was there. There was a lot of sabotage. There was a lot of criticism. There was a big opposition coming up. Mr. López Obrador was part of that, always critical. And there were serious mistakes. There were missing parts, the fourth pillar, which later they tried to introduce in 2010. So they were learning they were building the plane as they were flying it, so to speak. And Lupita was, of course, much more critical of the approach of the Calderón administration. And so trying to reconcile these two positions, it was a difficult book to write. But I think at the end of the day, we found a good solution. This is what people don't often realize, what it means to co-author a book. You have to negotiate. You have to negotiate the perspectives. You have to work through the lines, and you have to work through the organization. And I think Sergio, in that sense, was very, very helpful to both of us. And so, but I think we think the book is valuable, and it's valuable because it offers a good history of what happened. It also sets the grounds for some of the major mistakes that are still being committed, not the least of which is you're not going to do it without institutions. And it has important policy implications. We do not always place the policy implications in the book, but I think a smart reader can begin to eke them out. Many of which you just did, for example, that, okay, there's the mistakes and there's a history and there's a learning. The final thing I want to say in response to that, I think the greatest mistake with the López Obrador administration is that it may have overlearned the lesson of violence under the Calderón administration and is not willing to pay a single bit of a political price for confronting the cartels. But clearly it's not paying off, because the violence continues to get worse. And so it may be a completely different approach, but the result is the same, a country that continues to improvise its security and rule of law.
Guadalupe?
Yes, thank you, David. And this is a very important question. Let me start by thanking you, by thanking Tony and Sergio. Sergio really supported our work, and edited this work in order to make it a little bit more coherent. This project had a number of attempts to not be completed exactly because of the disagreements that we had during these years. It was a very interesting process and an example of what can be done no matter how much we can disagree on very crucial issues. When I was listening to your assessment of the Calderón administration on that period, I could say I cannot agree with most of what David is saying. I am one of those who is extremely critical of the years 2000, the end of 2006 and 2012. I believe that the result, what we have now with regards to security, of course, with all the problems and the lack of good proposals and institutions and ambition of the administrations that the López Obrador administration and Enrique Peña Nieto administration. With all that, I think that it was crucial. The decision that Felipe Calderón took was very detrimental to the country. And with all these notions of shared responsibility under the umbrella of the Merida Initiative and the so-called war on drugs in particular, the strategy itself was a complete mistake. It was not a complete mistake to decide to reform the police, to address the issues of security, that very big issues of security, and also to address the issues of this new model of organized crime that was more diversified, that was more militarized. But the way it was done, I think, was an enormous mistake. And this is something that a number of experts that we interviewed mentioned. They mentioned, and I remember that the rate of assassinations, the homicide rate in Mexico had not been increasing, had been decreasing. A new model of organized crime had started to show up by the end of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. I'm talking about Los Zetas. And what happened in the state of Guerrero, the state of Tamaulipas, the border overall in the beginning of the 20th century in the cities of Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, then the border between Texas and Tamaulipas, and other states like Veracruz, Tamaulipas, Tamaulipas is a northern state, and Guerrero and Michoacán. That was a major issue of security. But the strategy under the Merida Initiative, with the militarization and the problems along the way, were so enormous that we're paying the price. We are paying the price of those mistakes, and also the involvement of corruption and the link of major players during the Calderón administration. And I'm thinking about Genaro Garcia Luna, for example, and the federal police, the role of the federal police. That was the main project of former President Felipe Calderón, this massive police reform, and giving this protagonist, because if you read the book, the whole and all the sections mention something about Genaro Garcia Luna. All our interviews were mentioning him as a key protagonist, the key actor during these years. And he is right now waiting for a major trial, if there is a trial, in the United States of America, because of its alleged connections. Today we say alleged, but there are supposedly thousands of files and evidences that connect him with organized crime, particularly with the Sinaloa cartel. If that happens, how are you going to implement, how are you going to operate a security strategy of the extent that he planned it, without him being an expert on security, and with him being connected and giving him the biggest role in security to such a corrupt person that also collaborated very closely with the United States and operated what we call the kingpin strategy, that is the framework or the approach of the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States. Therefore, and because of many things, I am extremely critical of the Calderón period. Tony is less critical, and this is what led us to have a lot of differences. But in the end, I think that the product is interesting because we definitely, as Tony mentioned, we tried to let our voice not very strong, but we allowed the interviewees to let us know what happened, or at least the vision of what happened, and the critics to talk. So there was, and at the end, there was, an arrangement between us that we will not talk a lot. We definitely tried to make a final analysis or some recommendations that have to do with strengthening the institutions and what was the role of the United States in all these, that we have to be careful about that. But we kind of depicted what needed to be highlighted, right? And I'm happy that Tony and I, after this process that was very tortuous at some point, we stayed friends. We were able to continue working, and we'll be working together because this is what enriches a conversation, the differences in ideologies, ambitions, and the fact that we can work together. And this is something that our politicians probably need. I'm not trying to give any example or try to preach to the audience, but I learned from this process that things can be done, that we can accomplish things no matter how different we are, how different we think, and how our values lead to very different perspectives on issues. So I'm very happy. I appreciate Tony, his patience, his friendship. I appreciate Sergio, who also very patiently edited this work, provided us with guidance, eliminated some parts where we were probably a little bit more ideological than we should have been. And this was a very difficult book to write, but I'm very happy, and I thank you all for being here, and Tony and Sergio for their patience and for the help, especially Tony for his friendship.
Thanks, Guadalupe. I think as one reads the book, I could almost identify paragraphs with your fingerprints on them, and identify paragraphs with Tony's fingerprints on them. But I think your larger point there is really important. We live in an era, not just in Mexico, but in the United States and many other countries, of stark political polarization, where everyone is convinced of the absolute truth of their interpretation and convinced that the other side not only has it wrong, but has bad intentions. And I think that's crucial for both of our countries sort of going forward. How can we have these disagreements and talk about them without accusing the other side of acting in bad faith? And I think, one of the things you guys do well in the book is, the actors and the characters you interview clearly are going to have different things to say about it. I mean, Castañeda is going to be a voice that says, well, of course we didn't screw it all up in the Fox administration. Calderón made some mistakes. And Castañeda is a very smart guy. A lot of what he says makes a lot of sense to me. And then on the flip side, you have others who are saying, like Eduardo Guerrero and Astorga and Hope, saying, hey guys, put yourself in the position of a leader here. What do you do differently? And understand that yes, mistakes were made, but we can together draw the right conclusions. And I think I liked the last part of the book a little better because I felt that you guys were able to come together and find the right lessons, the lessons of, these institutions are crucial to solving this. Mexico is not going to solve this without the institutions. So how do we get to a place where, Calderón picked the wrong guy? We can see that now clearly. I sort of thought that at the time because he was too much of a protagonist, and he was putting his own label on the federal police, kind of like J. Edgar Hoover a little bit with the FBI. It was Hoover's institution. Well, this was Garcia Luna's institution, clearly. And he was stepping on the PGR's toes, and he was stepping over everybody else because he wanted to be identified with this. That was a mistake that was evident even during the administration. And now, as you say, that he's being processed for actual corruption. What a terrible development for Mexico, that the country tried to build a federal police force, and that the man who was in charge of it and whose name was identified with it has now faces these serious allegations of corruption, because who's going to be the next person to stand up and say, yeah, let's build a national police force in Mexico? It's a tough one. I wanted to ask, all three of you, and Sergio as well, one of the difficulties in this is, and I think you guys do a good job of getting past this, but at the beginning of the book, it's very clear that there's a difference between those who think that this was just completely unnecessary and those who think that it was necessary, but how else are you going to do it? So I'd like to ask you all, what would you think would have happened? I mean, the counterfactuals are impossible to know, but what would have happened had Calderón basically ignored the problem like Fox had? What do you think the consequences would have been? Guadalupe, you want to start?
Sure, David. I can start. Since I am one of the persons who probably, among this audience, among this group is the most critical, I would probably have done the things very differently. In my view, the so-called war on drugs, and this is how he referred to, it's a war against organized crime. I am declaring a war on drugs. He dressed himself in a military suit, which was a little bit, big for him, which is very interesting, the comparison to the reality. The suit fitted, no.
Le quedó grande. Totally.
Le quedó grande. El traje le quedó grande. And this is what some of the interviewers also said, which is true. He declared war on drugs, resembling to how the United States perceived. The United States is a different nation that declared war on everything because it's a bellicist country. It's a bellicist nation that has been made great because of its approach to war and his involvement in particular wars. The United States has declared a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on terror. Why Mexico had to declare a war on drugs? It was not our war. We needed to address this issue in a different form. We had an issue. We had an issue in different parts of the country. We had to do it with intelligence. We had to strengthen our institutions. We have to create a police that worked. As a matter of fact, in some states of Mexico, the local police was working for the so-called cartels or criminal organizations. Well, we had to address that issue, but we had to address it in another form. We didn't have to send the federal police all over the country and create a real war in the country, which is what happened. During that period of time, over 70,000, which were the official figures, over 70,000 people killed and around 30,000 people that were disappeared. We have now 100,000 people, 200 or 300,000 people killed until this time, which is debatable. The numbers, what is connected with other factors, and what is connected with the strategy itself. But anyway, I wouldn't have declared a war on drugs. I wouldn't have sent the military to fight this problem, even though, or send the military in some places. And this is what some of our interviewees told us. Even one member of the armed forces that we interviewed for the book. That strategy really benefited a number of actors that benefit from that, arm producing companies, banks, energy firms, big capital, in the end benefits from wars. And a lot of these companies have their base in the United States in the developed world. So this is why I would have changed very fundamentally the strategy. But I recognize that we had a problem with organized crime.
So what would your strategy? We know you wouldn't have militarized it, but what would you do? What steps would you take to try to control the growing influence of organized crime?
I think a police reform was badly needed. a police reform needed to happen. And Tony and I were able to interview Genaro Garcia Luna because before he was arrested, also with the help of Sergio Aguayo, this book was published by the Colegio de Mexico, and we published that interview with an analysis and with other interviews with other people who knew about the subject matter. It's called The 5 Lives of Genaro Garcia Luna, Las 5 Vidas de Genaro Garcia Luna. He explained us, and even though he was involved in very badly cases of corruption, he had a very good idea of how to deal with this police reform and how to centralize at the initial times. Sometimes, I mean, the kind of the control of the police, because of the fact that the local police at the Fed and the state police, particularly the local police, were connected completely with organized crime in some states of Mexico. So this had to be, this strategy that also comes from the Colombia strategy to some extent, needed to happen, right? Some people will probably will not agree in the type of police reform that needs to be done, but it needed to be done. Even Genaro Garcia Luna and Felipe Calderón and his team were talking about a semi-militarized police at that time, even. So, I mean, we can discuss the model, but police reform needed to be done. At the same time, we had militarized actors already acting in Mexico. We needed to send probably the military, but with intelligence first. I think our bodies of intelligence were not developed, and were developed with a lot of limitations during that period of time. The CISEN didn't do the work they had to do. It was important to create or strengthen the CISEN, the intelligence services of Mexico, but it wasn't done correctly. So before displaying all the forces, before creating, this very big clash between the armed forces and the militarized groups, criminal groups, you have to think about it. And this is why we call it an improvised war, because it was like, yes, we received some advice from the United States. Yes, let's go. Let's declare a war that is not our war.
Thanks, Guadalupe. Tony?
Yeah, look, I think it's always easier. What we're doing is some Monday night quarterbacking here. I think, I think it's easy to say what should have been done and or not done. But I think in that regard, I think I would say my light goes off if I don't move enough, I guess. And this is where I disagree. I mean, this is a problem from hell, if you will. And it has been a problem from hell. I think the interview with Eduardo Medina Mora was really key here because it gave us the historical context of why Mexico didn't build the institutions in advance. And I remember hearing Ernesto Cedillo Ponce de Leon in a conference in El Paso, Texas, in which he said that his greatest regret is to have lost a historical opportunity to begin a serious rule of law institutional scaffolding construction in the 1990s. That was the moment. I think that at the end of the day, the definition mattered. And I think the major mistake, and I agree with Lupita in this sense, is that it could have been defined as a war when it should have been defined as something else. But look, different presidents have approached it differently, right? And so what is the problem? And I think it begins with the definition of the problem. To me, Vicente Fox still defined it as a public security issue. Calderón comes in and defines it as a national security issue. Why did Calderón jump from a public security issue to a national security issue? Of course, Peña then defines it as a political problem, folds it into gobernación, which is essentially a political entity. And then now López Obrador defines it as a social problem. It's an inequality problem, which is also it's only one perspective of a very complex problem. And so I think what this requires is that leadership in Mexico take this particular problem and depoliticize it. In the book, we speak very well of the inability of the Calderón administration to bring the governors and the mayors of major cities along and build a national strategy, and then to get the civil society in there. By the way, he did try after Salvarcar in Ciudad Juarez, after the massacre in Salvarcar, he did try to get civil society and the dialogues and all that began. So I think this is kind of a national effort. It has to be made a national priority, and it has to be a multi-speed, multi-track effort where you build the courts, where you build the prison system, where you build the investigators and the police system, where you build. But I think the mistake is obviously, like you said, there is a moral hazard. It relied too much on the military. And I think this is, by the way, the mistake that López Obrador is making today, over reliance on the military, because that means he's not going to build the institutions. It's going to be a wasted sexennium. And I see an even worse problem that might be the consequence in the López Obrador administration, and that is there was some serious signals in the 2021 June elections that the organized crime is beginning to acquire political interests, because we often think of them as businesses, right? They have a business model, they do business, they're interested in making money, they're interested in corrupting the state to make money, they're interested in the state staying away from or out of their way. The reality is that we saw how actively they worked in favor of Morena and the López Obrador administration in the governor's races in Sinaloa, in Sonora, in Baja California, in Michoacán, in Guerrero. So they're beginning to taste that they may just have also a political agenda, and that's going to complicate things, and that's only going to postpone the institution building. I think there's a waste of an opportunity under the López Obrador administration because he had the wherewithal to call a grand dialogue nationwide, including the opposition, to talk about this issue and to come up with solutions, but he didn't do it. He chose a different tactical strategy, and that's going to be a waste. But that's what needs to be done. You begin building the political consensus. You begin defining the problem in a certain way. You begin identifying all the stakeholders, including society, including experts, including universities, including civil society in terms of think tanks and in terms of NGOs, and then you begin with the police reform that you have to do, and then you begin to take the military out of it or use it in very strategic operations. The problem with the military today is that it's being used on all kinds of operations. And that is a terrible mistake, but it's also a wasted opportunity to build the institutions, because you don't have to. You can rely on the military. So I think this is a multi-pronged strategy. It begins with the definition, it begins with the involvement, the political consensus, all the pieces that have to be put in place. Calderón didn't do it that way, and obviously he paid a price. Peña forgot about it. He neglected the issue. He essentially thought it was a political issue and let Gobernación deal with it. And now López Obrador thinks it's an economic and neoliberal issue. It's not a neoliberal issue. It's an issue of institutions, the hard work. Look, it took the United States between the 1930s to the 1960s to build the right law enforcement institutions. It took 30 years. No president in Mexico since the 1990s, I think, has understood that the country is different, that the country is a landscape of plurality of groups and interests and things like that. And so building national consensus, building the political consensus behind that serious rule of law scaffolding reforms is hard work, and none of them has wanted to do it. So we appreciate the fact that Mr. Calderón paid attention to the problem, and it's not missed on my analysis the fact that the context itself was changing. Politics was considerably more fragmented. Issues were going on. History was not what it used to be in Mexico. And so it really needs somebody who can think strategically, who can think seriously and multidimensionally. We don't have that leadership. Calderón was not that kind of leadership. Peña was not that kind of leadership. And López Obrador is not that kind of leadership. So unfortunately, to do this kind of hard multi-sexennial work and address each of these components simultaneously and put the right people to do it, I think it's going to have to wait for the next sexennial, maybe, just maybe. And this is why I'm not very optimistic about Mexico overcoming this important challenge.
I would agree with that, Tony. I've sort of become very disheartened about Mexico's willingness to build the right institutions it needs to address this problem. It's also just a social issue. I mean, when Zedillo says Mexico has three major problems, three major challenges, rule of law, rule of law, rule of law, what would happen for poor people in this country to have access to a judicial system that actually was fair and worked on their behalf? It would just revolutionize the country. It would allow entrepreneurship, people to invest their monies with some security that they're going to get a return on this. I'd like to just take advantage of that point because I've wondered, what's it going to take in Mexico to get politicians to sort of agree that this is a national priority and put aside their partisan differences. In Colombia, it took basically, having the water up until their lips before they acted. During Uribe's inauguration, the FARC were 40 kilometers from Bogota. They were close enough to lob mortars onto the presidential grounds during his inaugural speech. It took literally having the state be at complete risk of collapse before Colombia was able to more or less put it together. And, the problems of Uribe aside, I understand why Uribe is such a controversial character, and Colombia resorted to some solutions like the paramilitaries that were really unacceptable. But Colombian society, there was a consensus they needed to change. The business class was willing to pay more taxes to have that money earmarked to build security institutions. If you look at the money that Mexico spends on security and on its judicial system, compared to other countries like Colombia, like Chile, it is paltry. Mexico is not putting in the resources it needs. It hasn't yet committed to doing this. And I just hope it doesn't take having the water up to our lips in Mexico to be able to come together politically to do this. But as you say, I'm not really optimistic. Sergio, would you like to add your point of view to this? I'd love to hear from you. I don't know if Sergio dropped off.
Yes,
Yes,
yes. I was listening very carefully the response that Guadalupe made. I think that Calderón's mistakes was his arrogance and ignorance. And that was a terrible combination, but it was not only his fault. I would add that we in the academia and even in the newspapers, we were incapable of understanding the events that were already happening outside that were affecting the environment in which Mexican cartels would empower themselves to levels that have not been seen in other countries. Let me just briefly remind you that in 1986, in the trials of the Commission in New York, it was a fatal blow to the American mob. And that created some vacuums of power that were filled by the Colombians, and among others. 1993, when Pablo Escobar was executed in Medellin, that same year, the new system of radar system in the Caribbean was put in place, and that was going to force the Colombians to divert the shipments of cocaine from the Caribbean basin through Central America and Mexico. And that changed completely the source of income that the Mexican cartels had. And that was combined, by the way, with the weakening of the political system. So you had the fatal combination of a number of structural factors that nobody anticipated, not the CIA, not the FBI, not the Directorate of Federal Security, that, by the way, was dismantled in 1986, the same year when the mob was destroyed. Well, in Mexico, the Mexican government was delivering to the cartels the 50 most corrupt and brutal commanders because they didn't put them in jail, they just sent them to their homes and to the cartels. So, and Calderón didn't even anticipate, according to the book, the impact that the end of the veto of the sale of assault rifles in the US would have in the military capabilities of the Mexican cartels. I mean, and it was only 2 years before his term. So we were, but that was not, I insist, it was not only Calderón. Luis Astorga is, of course, a pioneer, but he was writing the history of the cartels, which is a different analysis that we didn't do. We didn't do the geopolitical analysis that was necessary to understand how the balance of power inside Mexico was shifting from the PRI, who was being dismantled by history and by mistakes and by many reasons, and the National Action Party was also being infected by the virus of the corruption of the PRI, because Calderón committed electoral fraud. So regardless if he launched the war to launder his electoral sins or not, that doesn't matter. I mean, he was unprepared. And I think that the title of the book is key, The Improvised War. It was not a well thought, because Calderón was not talking. The ambience was poisoned by the electoral world. And so the question is, what if? Which is relevant, for me it's irrelevant. The war was unavoidable. I mean, one way or the other, it has to come a moment when the federal government, be that perhaps if Andrés Manuel López Obrador had been the president in 2006, things would be different, perhaps. But the fact of the matter is that by 2006, the power of organized crime in Mexico was reaching levels that were unacceptable for any government, as was the case when, for a number of reasons in New York, the RICO laws and Giuliani, the arrival of Giuliani to the as district attorney, made them realize that there was the need to break the control that the mobs, the 5 families had in the concrete bluff, I mean, the construction business. So it is, I mean, of course, one can, and that's why we historians have tenure in our universities, because we are the ones who interpret or make these discussions. And what I am thinking now is, what is the responsibility of academia, journalism at this moment? And that's why I come back to my initial comment. We have to raise the point that 2024 will be a crucial year to redefine the strategy, a joint strategy, a shared strategy in assumption. Mexico, the US, the governments, but also societies, because what I have found in my research is the importance of societies' participation in this kind, not only of debates, but also in the formulation of public policy. That's what I think, of course, is the ideal. Perhaps will happen, perhaps not, perhaps will come in an even incomplete and imperfect way, but that's the way history works. I mean, this kind of debates are endless. What were the intentions of Hitler, and what was the debate in England in the 1920s, or just before Munich? I mean, the appeasement, I mean, that was a consensus. And now the consensus, the problem is that now there is not a discussion at the federal level. There is just a muddle through, hoping that somehow, someday, the phantom of the criminal cartels will go away, which is not going to happen, of course.
Thank you, Sergio. I think you're right. These questions are impossible to answer to everyone's satisfaction. I think we can all agree that sooner or later, the Mexican state had to take this on, and we hope that, we can all see the outlines of solutions. It's just the solutions are easy to see and difficult to make happen. But we hope that at least in 2024, there's the beginning of some kind of national consensus toward starting to implement that solution, which, as Tony points out, it's the work of a generation, it's the work of a country, civil society, the politicians, everybody. So we can only hope that that hard work can begin in 2024. Tony, are we out of time?
We can probably take 2 or 3 questions at once and do one wrap up and go. And this is obviously a very deep conversation. We'll have to invite you again, David, to do it. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. And by the way, this is what makes the Lopez Obrador administration such a tragic waste of political capital, because he did have the consensus and the ability to force the opposition to sit at the table to create a new model, and yet he chose to waste it. That is such an incredibly wasted opportunity that no president, by the way, perhaps since Salinas, had ever had. Salinas used it for something else, trade, neoliberals, and whatever you want to do. But after that, no one has had this kind of support.
You don't think Fox could have maybe tried? Fox
he could have tried. He could have tried, but he didn't really have, I think. He probably had a higher level of political capital than Calderón, much higher perhaps, but I don't think he was the man to do it. He didn't know how to do it. He thought that the change was coming by inertia, by a sheer shift in political parties. So it was a little bit of a wasted opportunity. But this is real capital, 53% of the vote. And an opposition that is weak enough that you can force them to the table to do something. Look, Magaloni explores a number of interesting things that I think cannot be forgotten and are still happening and getting worse. One of them is what you mentioned, which is Mexicans cannot expect anything from the judicial system. Daily justice is not there. If you get something stolen or whatever, you don't even go to the police. You don't even file a complaint. It's impossible to access day-to-day justice. 2, the lodged privilege structure of privileges in Mexico continues. We see how Mr. Lopez Obrador protects some people and then punishes other people. So the structure of privilege that he so much criticizes is still fully in place. He's not changed it. He still favors specific actors, not the least of which is, of course, Carlos Slim and Salinas Pliego and all the people. He's got his own elite, privileged elite. And then the final thing is, of course, the use of political justice. We see how he's using the Mexican IRS, SAT, and the WEF, and the federal prosecutor's office to go after his political enemies. It's such an incredible waste. The tragedy, more than Fox's, which may have had an opportunity, this is a real historical waste. It's really one of the greatest tragedies Mexico has seen in a long time.
Guadalupe, how are you viewing the AMLO administration so far on this score?
I believe that there are many problems and challenges that have not been addressed, and in a sense, what I hear about Sergio, we're really waiting for the presidential election for things to change. In the years 2006, 2012, everybody was thinking about 2012 when they were seeing what was happening in 2011, when Monterrey was in flames, and when all the Northeast and half of the country was on fire. Everybody was waiting for this to go back to what the PRI was, right? And so they voted for the PRI again. And the corruption, the Ayotzinapa, the Casablanca, and people have that in mind. No, we need a change. So we're waiting for the year 2018, to give an opportunity to a new leader. So we're waiting for 2018. We have not generated the consensus. We have not put anybody together to talk. The leadership does not exist, right? And now we're thinking about 2024. What kind of leadership has appeared? What kind of party? What has been the role of the opposition? You have just seen the party of the extreme right of Spain, Vox, had met with some of the membership of the party, the Partido Acción Nacional. And there has been like a break and a lot of problems with Va por Mexico, this coalition of parties that were against the current government of Mexico. What is the leadership we want? Where are we? Who's building some way to 2024? Nobody. I am very worried. Security is going to be the issue, and it's the issue that places more challenges to the continuation of the fourth transformation government, and it's not being addressed. What happens with the justice system overall, with all the institutions, with the Fiscalía General de la República, with General Prosecutor's Office, the prosecutor that just works for apparently his own purposes, and all the cases that are on the table are not going forward, are not moving forward. We have a number of problems that have not been addressed correctly. I don't share necessarily all what has been said, or I am not as critical as most of you are of the current administration. I give the current administration some credit for some things, and this the end of the war as it was conceived, it's important, but there's no other project. The creation of the National Guard as a form of reforming the police was not achieved. So I see problems, and we're not coming together to try to build something better, not even an opposition, neither in the government of the fourth transformation. And I'm sorry to be so negative, but this is what I am seeing. And I wish I could join a project, and I will continue teaching classes and participating in this fora. And I wish we all can sit together and participate in a project to improve the situation in the country, because the future is very dark as I see it.
Thanks, Guadalupe. And I would say that what this book does is offer sort of a blueprint, hopefully, for that to happen, because we can all disagree about the context and why this started and whether it was necessary, and even some of the strategy decisions. But just through all that, and despite those disagreements, we all more or less, I think the four of us more or less agree what a possible solution would look like, and the heavy lift that that's going to require. I think we're also a little pessimistic that the conditions exist for that to start to happen. But at least this book shows that, arguing about the past isn't going to be as useful as drawing the right lessons from the past and applying those hopefully in the future. Sergio, what do you think needs to happen in Mexico for rule of law, rule of law, rule of law to take place?
I'll be very brief because I have to go in a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, it's fascinating, the discussion, but I have another meeting. I think that we should not rely so much in our national leadership. The Mexican society is mature enough to start to launch initiatives at different levels, understanding that there is an impressive power sharing going on in Mexico. It is no longer a presidentialist country in which what the president does or thinks is what happens. That's not the case anymore. I mean, it is, and I could give you examples. Yesterday, the Ley Chayote, or the law to control media locations, was rejected by the Supreme Court, and also the Supreme Court passed a ruling that allowed abortion, or decriminalize abortion. No? It doesn't legalize abortion, it decriminalize. I think that in the case of security, society, organized society, academia, newspapers, NGOs, entrepreneurs should take the initiative in making proposals to those in power, not necessarily the president. I don't trust that the president has the energy, the interest, or the wisdom to focus on this, but there are a number of others, governors, that are willing to take a risk, and that's we should devote more time to that aspect. And to if I mentioned 24 is because I was referring to the joint agenda, Mexico-US agenda, which is necessary, of course, But in the case of Mexico, we have a wide field to cover in the near future. But I think that books like this one are really useful for that debate. And I am really sorry, but I am really late. I am already late for the other meeting.
That's
Nice
fine.
to see you.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Sergio. Thank you.
Hi.
Sergio
Thank you,
raised a good
Sergio.
point there at the end
Yeah.
about the U.S. role in all this, and I guess it's one area we didn't cover in depth. But I would say that we in journalism spill a lot of ink writing about the drugs that go north, and not enough about the guns and the money that come south. And I think for Americans and for people in the audience, it's important for Americans to try to understand their role in all this, the role of drug use in the United States. The numbers are just horrific. If 35,000 people die in Mexico's criminal violence every year, 70 to 80,000 are dying from drug overdoses in the United States. So it's a national emergency that is going largely unaddressed. The US needs to take a long, hard look at itself and the effect that it has on its neighbors. I think I wrote an essay with our Washington political correspondent, not to give a plug for my own work here, but about what the US withdrawal from Afghanistan means. And I think we can all sort of spot, the people we spoke to said it really marks part of a process of the US returning, looking inside again and looking inward. And that's all well and good that these grand military deployments overseas have failed to, especially in the aspect of nation building. But I spoke to one person from the American Enterprise Institute who said, well, what if we had spent half the amount of money we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan trying to create a safer and more prosperous hemisphere in our own region? And why don't we start thinking of how to be a better neighbor to Mexico? And hopefully the U.S. too can start to do some hard thinking on its part, not just what's in it for me. Can I just stop the drugs and arrest the bad guys? But how can I help Mexico build these institutions that, frankly, unless Mexico builds these institutions, migration is not going to go away. It's going to be a permanent part of the U.S. political landscape. So if you want to fix migration, fix Mexico's institutions, and maybe there's some nation building project that might be worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make just a final comment, not any more comments? It's about this idea of the war on drugs and drug trafficking as the center of the conversation. To explain violence in Mexico, the center is not drug trafficking or the drug trade. It's institutional limitations that we have, a very complex structure of corruption that comes from colonial times. It's much more complex to explain the problems that we have right now in Mexico. And the complicated relationship between the United States and Mexico should not be just focused on war and immigration. There are many more aspects to deal with the issues that we have right now. This is not a war on drugs. This is a war against corruption, a war against poverty. And the base of this is poverty and inequality. And we have to address these issues in order to address all this properly. But this requires, a considerable amount of time.
Agree. Any final comments, Tony?
No, I just want to thank you, David. Let's continue this conversation. This is a very important conversation for Mexico in the future of the binational relationship, and I think we should do an encore. So thank you, but thank you for helping us read this book and interpret what we wrote. Sometimes you read the book.
I congratulate you both. I do think there's some valuable lessons in here, and I do hope it gets widely read. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to those of you who stayed through almost an hour and a half, an hour and 25 minutes. I really appreciate the help that Sergio Aguayo gave us in producing and shepherding this book through its publication. I appreciate the many, many conversations and sometimes outright discussions even heated discussions with my co-author, Dr. Correa-Cabrera. We don't always see eye to eye, but we certainly march shoulder to shoulder. And I certainly very much thank David Luno for his comments and for leading this conversation today. And we'll see you in the next event of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you.